A long, long time ago, in a year very much like this one, in the year 1349, a cargo ship carrying grains and goods left jolly old England, headed to Norway. The captain and the crew followed every protocol of the quarantine in place in England. They were sure they brought none of the pandemic with them. However, when the ship finally reached its destination, the locals found it was only full of corpses. The crew and the captain, all dead. There were living creatures on board, though. Rats, feasting on the flesh of the fallen. And this is how the Black Death came to Norway. But if you listen oh so carefully on a night like tonight, you can hear the ghosts of the fallen haunting our music ever since that day. I'm Isaiah, and this is Halloween. In 1993, Disney released Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas through Touchstone Pictures instead of the mainstream Disney distribution brand. Why did they do that? Because they were worried about how dark and creepy Tim Burton's movie was. They were worried it might tarnish the family-friendly Disney brand that was cashing in on successes like The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin just the year before. The next year, it would be Lion King. I mean, it was a cash cow, let's be honest. So, they released it through Touchstone, and they did release a Halloween movie through the Disney brand that year, just not Nightmare Before Christmas. They released Hocus Pocus, with music by John Debney. Yeah, I know that movie is a bit of a cult classic these days, with Bette Midler and everybody else. But when it came out that year in 1993, it was a bomb. Nightmare Before Christmas, on the other hand, that was a huge success. Alright, so I gotta be honest with you. I didn't watch Nightmare Before Christmas back then in 93. Probably for the same reasons Disney put it out on Touchstone. It was dark, it was creepy. Disney was supposed to be family friendly. It just wasn't the sort of thing my parents would have been into. And I even remember people saying that Walt Disney was probably rolling in his grave over Nightmare Before Christmas, which is honestly a pretty ironically creepy way to describe how Disney would react to something being creepy, right? Also, more importantly, it was completely wrong. People seem to forget just how dark and creepy Disney could actually be, and how much fun he had with scary, spooky, creepy things. I mean, remember, Disney is the one who was behind the terrifying scene of Maleficent's transformation in Sleeping Beauty.
Now shall you deal with me, O Prince, and all the powers of hell!
Ichabod running away from the Headless Horseman. the absolutely terrifying and disturbing transformation scene in Pinocchio. And even his first feature-length film, Snow White, was considered so scary that children were peeing themselves in the theaters, which gave his arch-nemesis Max Fleischer fodder for the movie Gulliver's Travels, which was not scary and also a little bit not interesting. And don't forget that Disney was the one who authorized and gave the most creative insight into the Haunted Mansion attraction, even though he never got to see it completed. And it was Disney who revolutionized the entertainment world when he listened to an idea from his composer, Carl Stalling, and produced the Skeleton Dance, the first ever silly symphony. Of course, when that cartoon came out, it was banned from certain parts of the United States and also banned in whole countries around the world because it was creepy. Dancing skeletons. I mean, who the heck would think of something like that? Well, according to Carl Stalling, the idea was one that had been in his head ever since he was a kid, and he saw a shadow puppet show where skeletons danced on the screen. But where did that person come up with such a creepy concept to show to children? Turns out, skeletons have been a symbol of animation, even shadow puppet animation, from the very beginning. And I'm talking way, way back. All the way back to the days of the ghost ships that spread the Black Death to Norway. All right, so obviously death has been part of our human story for as long as there's been a human story to tell. The earliest epics and origin stories for humanity all have to do with death in some way, whether it's Gilgamesh facing the death of Enkidu in the Babylonian epic, or Adam and Eve losing their access to the Tree of Life in the Bible. But when it comes to modern Western art culture, it was actually the plague outbreak of the 14th century, the Black Death, that left a dark and creepy mark on aesthetic sensibilities that honestly do still haunt us to this day. Before that time, there was art in tombs and in catacombs and around other burial places. But the art that was there, more often than not, celebrated life. It celebrated the life that people had lived. And then once Europe embraced a Christian cultural paradigm, which was resurrection, the art started to highlight that as well. Then you come to the 1300s. Then you come to the plague. Then bodies start lining the streets for decades. Death, which was always a reality and always a fear, could no longer be avoided. And it also couldn't just be viewed as a step between current existence and then some future eternal existence. Now, death was a looming threat, inescapable, a visible enemy for every person, king and pauper, old and young. The art of the Middle Ages reflects this shift. Woodcuts and paintings during the 1300s portray death as a character itself. And most often, the character of death is portrayed in the form of a skeleton. A skeleton that's hunting people and impaling them, leading children away from their parents. Ugh. But death was also sometimes portrayed not quite so terrifying. Sometimes death was portrayed having fun, dancing even. Because that's what's amazing about humans and about human nature. We can only be afraid for so long before we begin to find ways to cope through humor and whimsy and even mocking. So, while the image of death transforms, or at least gets shaded, not only as being terrifying, but also as dancing, that image gets burned into the cultural eyes of the 14th century. But the sound of death was burrowing its way into the collective ear of everyone in Europe. I mean, with that much death, there are that many funerals. In the 14th century, funerals were accompanied by a Christian liturgy called a requiem, and one song in particular became, through all the repetition, the theme song for death. That song is the chant, Dies Irae.
Dies irae, dies illa, solvet seclum in favilla, teste David cum sibilla.
It's haunting, right? In more ways than one, too. Alright, spoiler alert, the plague eventually faded away. Humanity recovered, and artists' obsession with death fell to the wayside. Music largely focused on bright themes throughout the Baroque and Classical period. But then you get to the 18th and 19th century, and you come up on another outbreak, a new pandemic, or rather, new pandemics. Cholera and tuberculosis. So cholera was transmitted in the water, and it killed indiscriminately and at random times. I mean, people were literally dropping dead at costume parties. Clergy were wheezing their dying breath in the middle of sermons. It was absolutely terrifying. Meanwhile, you had tuberculosis, or as it was known in those days, consumption. And that was a slow, grueling death that could take years to finish its work. With this new reign of terror, death that could be either sudden or induce suffering, artists had to turn their eyes and ears back to their heritage from the 14th century. Guys like Edgar Allan Poe, who beat cholera but watched his mother and wife and several of his friends die from tuberculosis. He transferred his suffering into his pen to write some of the classic works of Gothic literature, such as The Raven. And spooky, creepy skeletons made a comeback as well in the visual arts, particularly skulls. You find them in the work of Cezanne and Van Gogh, as well as one particularly striking portrait by Charles Gilbert called All Is Vanity, which at first glance is just a woman looking at herself in the mirror, but when you squint your eyes, you realize the shadows, the placement of the woman and the mirror, they all form the shape of a skull. It was the Romantic period. It's time for people to get creative. Which brings us to music. Dies Irae, Death's theme song, came back with a vengeance. Like, it's the opening motif of Haydn's Symphony No. 103 in E-flat major. Liszt's Totentanz is a paraphrase of Dies Irae. Hector Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique uses Dies Irae during the Witches' Sabbath section. And then there's the piece of music that fused the image of dancing skeletons with the sound of Dies Irae, Danse Macabre by Camille Saint-Saëns. And we're going to talk more about that piece in just a minute. But Dies Irae, it sounds familiar to all of us, right? Like we all kind of feel like we recognize that opening line of melody. Well, that's because the practice of quoting Dies Irae continued past the Romantic composers into the movie era. Remember from our previous couple of episodes that we talked about how early silent films would utilize snippets of classical music to help theater organists construct soundtracks on the fly, right? Well, Dies Irae was one of those snippets, and it got used a lot. And then when Gottfried Huppertz composed the score for Metropolis in 1927, he turned to Dies Irae for inspiration. Since that time, the theme has shown up in countless movies. Like, for instance, it helped shade Stanley Kubrick's movies like Clockwork Orange and, most prominently, The Shining. The patron saint of movie soundtracks, John Williams, he loves Dies Irae. He used it in Close Encounters, as well as Jurassic Park, Indiana Jones, Harry Potter, and even Star Wars, if you show a little patience and listen closely. Hans Zimmer used Dies Irae in The Lion King.
Kill him.
Twice.
So you haven't told them your little secret. Well, Simba, now's your chance to tell them.
And so whenever Robert Lopez and Kristen Anderson Lopez needed to convey a mysterious, dangerous mood in Frozen 2, they used Dies Irae to open the song into the unknown. But nobody, and I mean nobody, has used Dies Irae the way Danny Elfman did in his soundtrack for Nightmare Before Christmas. It first shows up being sung by Jack, the dancing skeleton, who's the hero of the whole movie, in his ballad, Jack's Lament.
Oh, somewhere deep inside of these bones, an emptiness began to grow.
Now, it's only a snippet in that song, just a few notes, but it accompanies this key moment when Jack expresses his desire for something new. It's the I Want song of the movie. So then later on, when Jack's desires are realized and when all of Halloween Town is working together to make his dream come true, Elfman made sure we got Making Christmas, which is all Dies Irae.
This time, making Christmas. Making Christmas.
But Danny Elfman didn't just use Dies Irae as inspiration. In fact, he drew inspiration from the entirety of Camille Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre, which you can hear in the tolling bells and xylophone bones of This Is Halloween.
This is Halloween, this is Halloween, pumpkin scream in the dead of night. This is Halloween, everybody make a scene, trick or treat. Till the neighbors gonna die of fright.
Danse Macabre also served as the unusual inspiration for Disney's very first creepy cartoon, The Skeleton Dance. Unusual because musically, it's not really quoted, but formally, Danse Macabre is the skeleton for the cartoon structure. Both The Skeleton Dance and Danse Macabre start with a clock striking 12. Then skeletons rise from their graves to dance. But Carl Stalling was not some cheap copy artist, as we discussed in our last episode. He was the master of ironic symbolism and sonic contrasts. So he didn't utilize Danse Macabre as the soundtrack for the first Silly Symphony. Instead, he quoted a song by Edvard Grieg, Trolltog. Doing this was masterful, and it also played a psychological trick that Freud would find quite impressive. See, Grieg's Trolltog, or as it's translated, March of the Trolls, is one of his many pieces portraying mythical Scandinavian creatures like elves and giants. These pieces were often played for and by children, and by overlaying the image of dancing skeletons, which for hundreds of years had been the terrifying image of death, with the sound of a mythical fairy tale creature, Carl Stalling transformed the skeletons from being a grim reminder to a playful monster. Suddenly, these skeletons represent spooky ghost stories, Halloween masks, not my dead grandfather or my dying cousin. It's that spirit of playfulness about death that also inspired Tim Burton to make movies like Nightmare Before Christmas. In fact, when Tim Burton was just a kid, a lonely only child, he first encountered the dark terror of impending doom and then saw it transform into a cosmic joke. See, his parents got him a puppy so he wouldn't be so lonely, and he loved that puppy. But then the vet informed his family that the puppy had distemper, and Tim prepared himself for his puppy to die. He sat with the puppy and watched old horror movies play on television. They went on walks together in the nearby cemetery and watched the gravedigger do his work. Also, Tim would be prepared for his dog's inevitable demise. But then, his puppy didn't die. He got better. For Tim, that feeling of staring death in the face and earning the right to laugh, that became the theme for his movies, especially Nightmare Before Christmas. But there is more music in Stalling's Skeleton Dance than just Trolltog. What is that? It's actually quite simple. That is a foxtrot in a minor key that Stalling composed himself. Foxtrots are jazz dances from the same family as the cakewalk, which, if you've been listening, you might remember from our Steamboat Willie series that the cakewalk gave rise to ragtime and the music of Disney's very first animated short. Jazz also served as an inspiration for Danny Elfman when he needed to compose a theme song for the main antagonist in Nightmare Before Christmas, Oogie Boogie.
And if you aren't shaking, there's something very wrong. 'Cause this may be the last time you hear the boogie song. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm Oogie Boogie Man.
All right, so if you've been listening to this podcast, you might recognize Oogie Boogie's theme as a musical quotation. Yeah. That is straight from Cab Calloway's Minnie the Moocher, which was the first song used by the Fleischer Studios for Betty Boop.
She was a red-hot hoochie coocher. She was the roughest, toughest rail. But Minnie had a heart as big as a hay whale. Howdy, howdy, ho. Howdy, howdy, ho. Hidey, hidey, hi. Hidey, hidey, hi.
So while the execs at Disney feared Nightmare Before Christmas would push them into a different category of entertainment and wreck their brand, it didn't do that at all. Skeleton Dance, on the other hand, it put Disney into the category of making genuine art and of being a genius. Skeleton Dance and Silly Symphonies were the precursors to one of the most ambitious and artistic Disney movies ever, Fantasia, which built toward the climactic Night on Bald Mountain. Night on Bald Mountain by Mussorgsky was inspired by Liszt's Totentanz, which whispers the music of Dies Irae and the ghosts that landed on the shores of Norway over 600 years ago. Stay spooky, everyone. I'm Isaiah, and this has been Decomposed. That concludes the first season of this here podcast, y'all. Thank you so much for listening, for supporting. I'm going to be back sometime in January with season 2. We're going to be talking about Frank Churchill, the Three Little Pigs, and so much more. Until then, please share this podcast. Share this season with your friends. Share it with your enemies. Subscribe. Shoot me an email at isaiah@atombommedia.com. And please follow me on Instagram and/or Twitter. I'm at IsaiahJC. Please keep on listening to the music that made us, the music of Disney. I'll see you guys later.